Hello and a very warm welcome to the latest edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. And once again, we're in our spiritual home, and it's the Press Bar in Glasgow, the award-winning Press Bar in Glasgow. Alex, who do we have today?
Well, Bernard, yes, we're back in the Press Bar, and we have a very special guest here today, newly crowned Scottish Politician of the Year. Your mileage may vary on how much that bauble is worth, of course, but I'm delighted to say, Bernard, that we're joined by the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, ANAS Sarwar.
ANAS, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Now, one of the things that we like to do, because we know that our listeners and viewers find this very, very instructive, is that people will know you from being the leader of Scottish Labour, watching you at First Minister's Questions, watching you in television. But who is ANAS Sarwar? Tell us a little bit about the background story.
So my family came here in the 1940s, and my mum grew up in Lossiemouth. That's where my grandfather came and settled. He always thought he was going to come here and just work for a few years, to be honest, and send money back and then eventually go back himself, but instead fell in love with Scotland, brought his own family here. My mum moved to Glasgow when she was in her early 20s, when she got married to my dad, who came over as a migrant over here, and we were born and brought up in Glasgow. And I was a dentist before going into politics. I'm looking at your teeth right now, Bernard. And I did that because I believed in public service. I didn't really fancy going into politics, and that was my great escape from politics. But I got the bug, chose to stand for election, was elected to Westminster before being part of the tsunami in 2015. Enjoyed my year out and enjoyed the Scottish Parliament in 2016.
And so what's
But enjoy being a dentist in particular in Paisley is where I practice, and one of the most challenging parts in terms of oral health anywhere in Europe, actually, and learnt so much from it, actually.
I mean, your father, Mohammed Sarwar, was MP for Glasgow Central, of course. You stepped into his shoes in 2010 when he stood down. You, I won't say inherited the seat, but what's your sort of earliest political memory, though?
I think the earliest political memory is probably probably quite a negative one, when my father was trying to seek to be a candidate in the election, was hoping to be Britain's first Muslim MP, and leaving to go to school and seeing a really strange looking envelope on our doorstep, and being a eager and keen but naive child, picked it up, opened it up, and it was cut out letters and a mocked up picture of my mum tied to a chair with two guns pointed to her head with the message, "Bang, bang, that's all it takes." And as you can imagine, completely discombobulated by it, and took out to my parents and explained it was Combat 18 who were trying to obviously campaign and intimidate my father, so he didn't get involved in politics. So that's probably where I started questioning more, talking more about politics. So that's probably my earliest political memory. In terms of earliest political campaigns, it's probably the petition, the campaign to save the Govan shipyard was probably the first political campaign I was involved in, and where I really whet a positive appetite about the positive force of what politics can be.
You were just a lad, but I covered every twist and turn of your dad's selection in what was a
I saw you quite a bit when I was growing up, Bernard, actually.
I
I should call you Uncle Bernard, didn't I, for the podcast?
Mind boggles.
And of course, it was just to remind viewers and listeners, it was a redrawn parliamentary constituency. Mike Watson was the sitting MP. There was a selection. Mike Watson won the selection, but there was, I think, over 50 votes that were discounted. This created a brouhaha. There was a second selection conference, which your dad won. Now, this, again, is in the mists of time, but as a political story at the time, it was leading news bulletins, and it was saturation and coverage in newspapers. You would have been quite young looking at this, and therefore you would have got a flavour as a very, very young man. If you dip your toes in the political waters, they're not always comfortable.
Well, I mean, I would have been 12, 13 years old at the time, and so it was huge. I mean, we were getting asked about it when we were going to school, and the old man was on TV and radio often. I remember listening at my granny's house when my dad was at the selection, and we were listening on the radio to see who'd won the selection count and all the furore that came from it. And I remember the emotion on my granny's face when he'd lost that first selection. But it's really interesting because my father and I actually laugh about it now, because when he first entered into politics, he was taking the Scottish Labour Party to the High Court to overturn a selection process, and then eventually became a Scottish Labour candidate. And then some 20 years later, his son becomes leader of the Scottish Labour Party. So it's quite a story of takeover from father taking it to the court and son leading them 20 years later or so.
Well, I mean, I think I've mentioned this to you before. I met your father once when he was in Pakistan.
You went to play cricket, of course.
I did, yes. And he was governor of the Punjab at that time. And I remember joking with him and so on, saying that his years in Scottish Labour must have been excellent training for the comparatively simple and straightforward ethical business of navigating the waters of Pakistani politics. But, you alluded to, death threats or abuse and so on being sent through the post to your father when he was, looking to get into politics. I mean, how large a part, if you like, did questions of race, of ethnicity and so on play in your childhood?
I think less about race and ethnicity. I think more, because people often think that, I'll have been driven into politics by my father, or I have similar politics to my father. Actually, I think I've got pretty different politics to my father in many ways. Actually, what I think where I get my politics from, and where I was driven to be political, was actually from my mother, because my mum was the rock in our family throughout all those challenges. You'll know that from your time covering it, Bernard, about how big a part my mum was in terms of keeping our household group together, about keeping literally my dad on his feet going through some of those big challenges. And the thing that's ingrained in my head from when we were growing up, 12 or 13 years old, to even to today, is my mum always saying, we never give up, we keep going, we keep fighting. If we walk away, they win. We stay and we fight. And that is actually probably a very similar story to how I've stayed and fought and tried to get the Labour Party back to where I think it should be, in a position to, yes, win an election across the UK, but hopefully to win an election here in Scotland. So I think I get that drive mainly from my mother. In terms of race and religion, look, I can't pretend it's not been a feature, but it's never anything that I felt held me back. It's actually only ever really encouraged me. And again, I think that primarily comes from that focus my mum had.
One thing that you do have in common with your dad is that your dad was
Don't say the hairline, Bernard, that'll be offensive. Don't say the hairline.
Your dad was a ferocious networker. I mean, I remember, I met your father for the first time when he was the parliamentary candidate, not when he was the member of parliament. And he went out of his way to ensure that he was also on very, very good terms with people within the broader party and the movement of all shades of opinion, incidentally, within the party, which I thought, this guy's fairly wise. This guy is actually an operator. But in terms of that particular time, who was coming in and out the house politically? Because I seem to remember, I suspect perhaps not now, probably saw a lot of George Galloway back in the day.
I mean, my dad was an absolute charmer when in the early days, and he actually not lost any of that charm just now. So he was very, very charming and very good in terms of a political operator. And I think, if anything, I probably learned that side of politics a bit from him, rather than maybe around policy ideology. I think he's less ideological. I think he's less political in terms of policy, but in terms of operating, engagement, networking, he was an absolute master of it. And that's why, he came to a country here in his mid-20s, very, very broken English, if any English at all, and was able to be Britain's first Muslim MP. It's why he was able to migrate back to Pakistan and be governor twice in Pakistan, is because of that ability to make relationships and have those networks, which is fantastic. George, we saw quite a bit of George when I was growing up. Him and my dad had an interesting relationship. They were friends at moments, foes even more moments. had plenty of barneys, plenty of disagreements. I think there are individual political issues that they probably had a common interest and care about, the Middle East being one, but I think they probably came at it from really different perspectives. So we saw a wee bit of George. I saw loads of Donald Dewar when I was growing up. Saw lots of Jack McConnell when I was growing up, lots of Glasgow politicians, as you can imagine. And my father was really, really close to Robin Cook as well, and actually spoke at his funeral. And it's one of those things, again, I remember growing up is I used to help my dad write his speeches for him when he was in Parliament, and one great honour is helping him write a speech for Robin Cook's funeral.
Do you think you would have got into politics without that kind of background?
I think I would have still been political. I think I would have still been in the Labour Party. I think I would have still campaigned. Whether I would have thought or believed that politics was for me, I'm not sure. Because I think there's lots of people, and this is perhaps where race and religion does come in. I imagine there's lots of people that are really political but think it's not for me or I wouldn't be welcome. I never had that because I was involved, I was welcome, I was going to Labour Party events, I was going to Labour Party campaigns, and so I didn't feel as if I had a barrier in terms of getting my foot in the door. But whether ultimately someone from what would be seen as a minority background where politics doesn't seem for them, they would have got involved, I'm not sure. But I was always political, yes.
I mean, of course, over the, well, not now, but for a year or so, we had a situation where the leader of the SNP and the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, the First Minister of Scotland and the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, both Pakistani Scots, both educated at Hutcheson's Grammar School in the south side of Glasgow. I guess you and Hamza Yusuf would have overlapped there. You weren't exact contemporaries. I'm just wondering, what advantages do you think Hutcheson's gave you?
It's really interesting because lots of people think because we went to the same school that somehow, they must have been pals at school or came across each other at school. I think Hamza was a couple of years below me. And I actually only remember having one conversation with him at school. And he was an ardent nationalist then as well. He was arguing for independence and how the Labour Party was the cause of all problems in our country. He probably still has the exact same view, I would imagine. And I was a defender of the Labour Party then, as I am a ferocious advocate for it now. I think a good question. I actually don't think it's a coincidence actually that you probably do see probably the two highest profile ethnic minority politicians in the country having gone to a school like Hutchie, because I think one of the things that it does teach you, whether it's direct or inadvertent, is probably confidence. And I think that's one of the big gaps in our education much more broadly, is there is so much ferocious, amazing ability, talent right across the country, but giving people that push, giving young kids that push, giving them that confidence to go out, perhaps doesn't exist everywhere, and maybe that's what the key thing and driver was from that school we both went to.
Let me take you back to something you said, that your politics and your father's are not exactly the same. I think you said that you were perhaps a little bit more ideological than your dad. How does that actually manifest itself practically in terms of Labour politics? Where are you more ideologically robust, and what issues that he would take perhaps a slightly different point of view?
So I think a lot of his politics would have been driven by foreign policy, for example. I think partly because he was born and brought up outside of the UK, and so was driven by foreign policy concerns. I think that would have been a huge driver for him. I don't think he was particularly ideological around the kind of left of centre or left argument you have in the party. I'm not sure he would have taken a particularly strong view about, for example, how you reform and renew our health service, or what our balance of tax system looks like. I don't really think he was driven by what does public service delivery, what does economic drive for our country look like. I think it was much more broad brush than that. So I think he was less ideological in that sense. I think the reason why he was in the Labour Party was, one, he probably thought the Labour Party more reflect his global view of the world. I think he was in the Labour Party more because he thought the Labour Party was a more natural home for someone that came from a migrant community and for migrants to go and do well in country. I think he probably was in the Labour Party because he's very driven by charity, and that's what he spends his time doing now with his own charity foundation in Pakistan, is driven by opportunity and how a Labour Party is more for supporting those that come from a more challenging background to get equal opportunity. So I think that was his view and frame of why the Labour Party was a natural home, and that was the issues he campaigned on. Whereas for me, I think being now third generation migrant, if you look at my grandfather's settling in Lossiemouth, is I now more think about actually what does Scotland look like now? What do I want Scotland to be when my children are my age? What does the health service need to look like? What does our skill system need to look like? How do we maximise the growth opportunities that exist in Scotland? How do we take Scotland in a different direction? And what does Scotland's place in the UK and Scotland's place in the world look like? So I think from that sense, probably very, very different frames.
And you were elected as MP for Glasgow Central at, I think it was the age of 27, wasn't
27,
it?
that's
27, right. In 2010. You then lost the seat in 2015, defeated by Alison Thewlis of the SNP. I'm just wondering, what lessons did you learn from that defeat?
So it's interesting.
If any.
No, loads. Actually, loads. It's interesting because people will think that what drives a politician or what shapes a politician is the successes they have. But I can honestly say that the two most professionally difficult moments in my life were losing that election in 2015 and losing the leadership election in 2017. So, of course, there's lots of personal difficulties that come through anyone's life, but professionally, they were the two darkest, most difficult moments in my professional life. But actually, I look back on both of those moments and I actually think they are probably the two best things that ever happened to me professionally and politically. Because I learned so much more from those two defeats than I did from any of the successes. And you might say in the last 14 or 15 years, we have very, very few successes. But those two defeats, I'll tell you what I mean by that is, one, I think when you come into politics as a 27-year-old, looking back, I mean, really, really young, and I look back and think, my goodness, I was probably far too young then, back then as well. An element of naivety. I think you're still growing in terms of your politics, growing in terms of your thinking, growing in terms of what drives you as a human being. And I look back then when I was a 27-year-old, and you are idealistic. You do, I think, are much more entrenched in your own politics, thinking that everything you say or everything your party says is 100% right and gospel, and everything your opponents say and everything opposition party says must be automatically wrong. Sometimes you may perhaps even believe your own hype far too much as well. Whereas I think that defeat in 2015 and losing the leader, and then also in terms of 2017, you have a view of, we often talk about the Labour family. You have a view of family and you think family can only ever get on, right? You never think actually family is also very good at, dividing and sticking a dagger in as well. So that was a massive eye-opener in terms of the leadership election in 2017. But I honestly look after the 2015, 2017, it stripped me of all ambition. It stripped me of all the inhibitions I had about things I was comfortable talking about, things I wasn't comfortable talking about. It made me more comfortable in my own skin. It helped shape me as the kind of politician I am now. It's driven me more about purpose and outcome rather than just simple success and being elected. And I honestly believe that defeat in 2015 and losing the leadership election in 2017 has made me a better human being, has made me a better father, and has made me a better politician.
I mean, the Labour Party's history, in a sense, has been a tension between Class 4 socialists and social democrats. That's the ideological fault line, I suppose. And at various points in Labour history, various emotional spasms have taken it off to the left. And in a sense, the two elections of Jeremy Corbyn and then Richard Leonard in Scotland perhaps can be seen through that prism. And normally what happens is that after electoral defeats, the party reassesses where it should stand ideologically and comes back to a more sort of social democratic position. So let me ask you, if you were defining where you stand in terms of Labour's ideological spectrum, would you identify with any particular wing, or like your father, do you regard your politics as more practical than ideological?
So I think I'm certainly a left of centre politician. I'm relaxed about people calling me a socialist. Alec might get nervous about calling me I'm relaxed about being a socialist. I'm
He might
relaxed
faint.
About, yeah, exactly.
I might be hell of a surprise.
He might take to stiff
Yeah,
drink.
yeah, honestly, so you know, I would call myself a socialist. I'm relaxed about being a socialist, but I think I'm a modern socialist. And what I mean by that is I think, and this I think is one of the great lessons from the Corbyn years, is I think we got into a frame where everything was absolute, as if those that were Corbynista, left wing, or moderate, or as you referenced last week, soft left, or those moderate, all three camps think every single thing they think is right and everything else somebody else thinks is wrong. But in actual fact, on some issues, some of them are probably right, and some issues, some of them are definitely wrong. And I think I'm much more pragmatic in that sense. And anyone that thinks the Labour Party is this ideologically pure organisation that, as long as it goes to bed comfortable with itself at night but still wakes up the next morning having lost and continuing to lose, I think doesn't really understand what a Labour Party was designed for. The Labour Party was designed to be a party of government, not a party of protest. It was designed, of course, to deliver for working people, but you only get to deliver for working people not if you're just out protesting, but actually in government, in parliaments, delivering for people. And that's the approach I take, is what are the pragmatic positions and solutions to actually move forward and make progress in our country. And I just think we've had a debate for far too long in the Labour Party about ideological purity. That's why we kept getting gubbed. And I always believe the electorate are right, and we were wrong. We had to change. That's why the UK Labour Party, of course, changed under Keir Starmer's leadership. The Scottish Labour Party has changed fundamentally in the 3.5 years I've been leader, but ultimately I want Scotland to change. But to change Scotland, we've got to win the election in 2026.
I mean, yeah, and you referenced that you've been leader now for 3.5 years since Keir Starmer effectively sacked Richard Leonard. What was Labour's core vote at the time that happened? What percentage of people do you think, or did the party think, could be counted on, relied upon to vote Labour regardless of leadership or circumstance at that time?
Well, I'll give you some scary stats from that time, Alec. Is when I became leader 3.5 years ago, we were about 10 weeks out from a Scottish Parliament election, and we'd done private polling which showed that only 14% of the electorate said they were going to vote Labour in an election. Only 8% said they would definitely vote Labour in an election. We were 32 points behind the SNP. We were up against the First Minister, had an approval rating of plus 52 points. And we had a political organisation that was shot to bits. And in the 12 months prior to me becoming leader, we'd only raised £250 in terms of fundraising for a political organisation. So we had little or no organisation. We had no baseline vote. Our core vote was shot to bits. Only 7% of people thought Labour could actually win an election, and we had to build from that base. So I often get asked lots of times over the last 3.5 years whether I feel pressure or anything else. I tell you what pressure is: taking on a job with 10 weeks till an election and where you're trying to survive. So we were in a really, really bad place, and that's why we had to fundamentally change. It wasn't because we weren't shouting loud enough about all the great things we believed. It was because people thought we weren't a fit-for-purpose, future-looking Labour Party. It looked like we were trying to fight battles of the old, and that's why we had to, yes, get a message. Yes, we had to have a better policy platform, but fundamentally we had to rebuild as an organisation, and we've done that rebuilding now. We are organisationally, we are the strongest we have ever been here in Scotland, and ready and looking forward to an election in 2026.
Let me make an observation and get your comments on it. I would say that sort of Scottish Labour have had the benefit of an administration at Holyrood that has been in a long time, and where its record is finally coming back to to haunt them. I think, secondly, people have, some people, not all people, but some people have genuinely tired of the constitutional debate and want a debate about the bread and butter of politics. And then, of course, a landslide victory for Labour at the general election in July is overwhelmingly a good thing for you. And, of course, a lot of that, the building blocks of that victory were made here in Scotland. But a lot of the support for Scottish Labour, I would suggest, is soft because it is a reaction to the record of the current administration. And in terms of 2026, my view is that you still have an absolutely huge challenge to seal the deal with voters, principally because I think they'll look at Scottish Labour, and you lead Scottish Labour, and say, we're still not really sure where it's going, where it's headed, what devolution would look like, and how it would be different if they won in 2026.
So I would wholeheartedly agree on the point about we still have an absolute mountain to climb, and I don't pretend otherwise. We've climbed 2 mountains already. I'm more than ready and willing and prepared to climb a 3rd mountain to make sure we win the election in 2026. I think it's important to set a context about the election we've just had, where across the UK you saw Labour's share of the vote increase by 1.6% outside of Scotland, and in Scotland we increased our share of the vote by 16%, and that shows you the big difference in leap we made in Scotland compared to other parts of the country. And I think fundamentally 3 things are going to broadly decide the election in 2026. First is whether people think that this SNP government has a good record and whether they should be turfed from office or not. Second, whether they think Scottish Labour has a credible alternative plan. And third, if they believe a UK Labour government is delivering for Scotland. Now, the SNP will sort themselves out in terms of people believing that they are shot to bits or not in terms of the first part. I think their record speaks for itself in terms of a record of failure. And I think you can see right across the country people are rejecting their performance and their record and want to send them not just a message but send them out of government. I think you'll see itself whether a UK Labour government can effectively deliver for Scotland. I think there are positive signs. I think we've delivered on first steps, but don't get me wrong, still work to do. And as a former dentist, I think it's safe to say there's been some teething problems in the early days. But fundamentally, the bit that I'm focused most on is delivering that positive alternative. And the frame we're setting for that is, if we look at what Scotland is right now, I think it's safe to say that every single institution in Scotland is now weaker after 17 years of SNP government rather than stronger. And I think there is every indication that the SNP is taking us in the wrong direction, and we need a new direction of our politics here in Scotland. And what does that mean in practice about what we're going to do? I want, first of all, to make sure that we have a politics in Scotland that reflects actually the priorities of people in Scotland. So you'll have heard me say this before. I think if I've got one big criticism of the Parliament over the last 25 years is that, and it's a good thing that we focused on social policy in terms of some of the outcomes, but it's been an economic policy free zone. And I think that has undermined our opportunities and undermined our growth potential, and therefore undermined maximising the outcomes from devolution.
We will agree with that.
And I can see Alex is itching to say, okay, so what are you going to do about it? And I'm coming to that. And I'm coming to that in a second. And again, I think what makes this leadership of the Scottish Labour Party different from others is, I think when people look at the Scottish Labour Party, they think it's a vehicle for social change. But I think what makes this leadership of the Scottish Labour Party different, you only get to deliver social change if it's backed up with a strong growing economy. And we have levers here in Scotland that we can pull that the Scottish Government's currently not pulling. So that's one part around economic policy. And on social policy, we are going to fight the election on reforming and renewing and rebuilding our health and social care system, which is fundamentally broken. Now, I can see Alex is itching to ask me about what we would do differently on the economy, and I'm more than happy. If you want to come in quickly first, Alex, and then I can set some of that out in more detail.
You said earlier that you're very comfortable calling yourself a socialist. Okay, so just in terms of conceptual or worldview type thing, public spending in Scotland is equal to around 50% of GDP. It's 55% of onshore GDP. Is that too much?
So I think our balance of public spending in Scotland, which is obviously going to go up in Scotland because of the budget, I think is broadly fine. I think the reason why people have a concern, though, is is they see themselves paying more and more tax, particularly if you're earning over £29,000, but getting less and less for it. And I think that's where the disconnect is. And so we've got to be better at how we spend money. And I think one of the big frustrations we have with Scottish politics, and certainly with this current Scottish government, is everything is driven on inputs. They want to see how they've thrown a few million here, how they've thrown a few million there, but they're not focused on outcomes. And when it comes to the outcomes, in every single measure of outcomes, we are not performing as well as we should be or can here in Scotland, and specifically on using the levers of our Parliament. So people, the SNP often want to say that all our problems is because of Westminster, but it also feels that they want to portray that somehow we're going to wait for Westminster to fix all our problems as well. Actually, I'm not waiting for Westminster to fix all our problems. I think we've got the skills, we've got the talent, we've got the resource, we've got the powers to fix so many of the issues in Scotland by ourselves. And take Greater Manchester as an example, because you guys know that I care about regional development, regional economic development. And I think that's the next stage of devolution. Actually, is pushing power out of Holyrood and into the regions of Scotland. Is Greater Manchester has fewer levers than we have. They have less resources than we have, but they aren't waiting for Westminster to fix their problems. They're getting on with it, being deal makers and getting things done. And that's the approach we would take in Scotland as well. We think the role of government should be to be a genuine partner with business. So that's not just legislation heavy, regulation heavy, but partnering with business and with the voluntary sector to maximise the outcomes the government expects. The second role should be to be a strategic systems planner in terms of what does the pipeline of work look like that we want to develop here in Scotland. I think the Scottish Government feels like it takes a standoff approach in the economy rather than being a participant and really being a deal maker. Third, the convening power of government. Again, I think government can act to bring business to business together, sector to sector together to get things done that don't require legislation and regulation in Parliament. We've set out... Sorry, you want to come in, Alex?
There's nothing in any of that Kate Forbes would disagree with.
Except the outcomes speak differently, doesn't it? Kate Forbes might say that she believes these things, but sitting around the cabinet table, either she's outnumbered or she's not pushing it or they don't listen to her because the outcomes don't match the actual inputs or the message of government. And I don't think government does act like any of those things that I've said they should act like. In terms of what I think the areas for the low-hanging fruit of growth for us here in Scotland is the opportunities of the clean energy revolution, digital innovation and tech, which, yes, I heard Jackie talking about last week, the impact that has on the public sector, but actually a huge opportunity for the voluntary and private sector as well. And third is brand Scotland and tourism. The way I think about it in my own head is we've had a government here in Scotland that's focused on selling Scotland to the Scots. We all know how brilliant Scotland is. No one needs to tell us how brilliant Scotland is. I want us to go back to selling Scotland to the rest of the UK and the rest of the world. And we have key levers in Scotland that we can pull on tax, on planning, on rates, on regional economic development, on the enterprise agencies, around transport, around skills. All of that, we have the power to deal with things here in Scotland, and we will take a proactive approach in all 7 of those levers to get better outcomes for Scotland.
These are all absolutely the right things that you should be concentrating on. What you've, I think, reeled off there is a succession of areas. I don't think you've necessarily defined an economic strategy. And let me put to you what I think the problem is with Scottish Labour vis-a-vis business. It's no secret that you've gone out of your way correctly, because every politician that wants to see economic growth should be close to business. You've gone out of your way to try and persuade people to listen to what Labour are planning to do on business. And of course, since Nicola Sturgeon went into Bute House, the cry from business was that there was no access, there was no convening, there was no strategic plan. But the issue I think that you have is that when people look at the policy of the UK Chancellor, and to a certain extent the party at the UK level did precisely this couriering up to business ahead of the election, they see that post the election, that in terms of taxation, Labour have gone down the road of putting all of its eggs into the national insurance basket. And it looks like a very, very old Labour policy of every time you want to spend money, simply take it from business. Simply take it from business. And people are already saying, and the papers have been full of it in the last week, this is not what we expected when we gave Labour at a UK level a sympathetic hearing. And I think that will be a problem for you, because people will say, well, ANAS is really just saying what Rachel Reeves was saying before the election. But all of the evidence is that when it actually comes to it, they go back to their old ways of simply looking at business as a cash cow and as not as a model for economic growth.
Well, I think it depends about separating the levers. So the levers I've set out are levers we have here in Scotland. And actually, we can demonstrate what we would do differently. I'm happy to go into more detail, but let me answer the point about our UK colleagues then come to those specific levers in Scotland, what we would specifically do in those areas, because I think if we're clear about what we're planning to use those levers for and the outcomes we want, then I think we can get confidence from business that we are taking the right approach here in Scotland. I think our challenge we have, I think you're right to set that frame, Bernard, where we went into the UK general election saying that there was the way that we ultimately get out of our problems is to grow the size of the cake rather than slicing the cake even thinner. And the great way of achieving the outcomes we want across the UK was fundamentally in achieving economic growth, much more significant economic growth that would unleash the resources that allowed us to reform our public services and to maximise the opportunities and the outcomes. I think the challenge we have is I don't think we can or should judge a Chancellor or a Labour government on their economic priorities and the kind of nation they are trying to build with one Labour budget. I think it'd be unfair to say that all of the UK's problems started 4 months ago, or all of the UK's problems can be fixed in 4 months.
Agreed, but it was a budget that business were not expecting, not anticipating, and in some respects regarded it as not consistent with the mood music pre the election.
No, I get some businesses are saying that, Bernard, but again, I think it's important to, I won't rehearse the context, but it's also important, I think, to look at the choices. So and one point I make about context, though, is I think any new government comes in and they've either got a flatlining economy, or they've got a decimation of the public services, or they've got a complete destruction of the public finances. The reality is Labour came in with all three at the exact same time. And in that context, it had choices. The first choice was, do you confront a fiscal black hole immediately, or do you long grass it? She chose to confront it immediately. Second choice was, do you put significant investment into our public services to end that era of austerity, or again, do you long grass it? She chose to put that significant investment in our public services. And third, if that's the choice you make on those first two questions, then if you have to increase revenue, where does that additional revenue come from? And you could choose to put that burden on working people who have already felt the biggest burden of the cost of living crisis, or you can make different choices, and the national insurance increase was the choice that was made. Now, people will disagree with it. Some people will agree, some people will disagree. But ultimately, people have to say, if they disagree with that choice, where else would they have found the £40 billion required that the Chancellor had to find? Now, John Swinney is suggesting income tax rising to find the £40 billion. I don't think increasing the basic rate of income tax is the right solution. In actual fact, given the way the fiscal framework works, we would have actually lost money in Scotland as a result of increasing basic rate of income tax. And I'm not sure he necessarily understands that. In terms of our choice on our own levers, we're being really open about it. One of them is tax. I think our tax burden has got too high here in Scotland around income tax. I think people earning £29,000 shouldn't be regarded as having the broadest shoulders in our country and therefore having to pay a higher tax burden. I don't think people think they get more for the additional tax. I think they feel they get less. I think our challenge is, I do want to bring down the tax burden here in Scotland. Our challenge, though, is I'm not going to write a Labour budget now, 18 months out, but also I do actually think that growth is the answer of how we get additional investment and how we can work to then reduce the tax burden across the country. That's what we've got to be our ambition. On planning, we're sitting in the city of Glasgow, my home city. I think one of the great cities, if not the greatest city in the country. But if we're honest with ourselves, Glasgow feels neglected, it feels let down, and we're being eaten alive by other places, because Manchester, if you try and apply for a planning application, is taking 16 to 18 weeks. In Glasgow, you're looking at a minimum of 59 weeks. If you're an investor trying to build homes, are you going to go to Manchester or are you going to come to Glasgow? So we've got to reform our planning system, and that's why we've said we would create a national planning agency that would take capacity, yes, from public sector, but also capacity from the private sector, so we can fast track applications that are regarded as drivers of economic growth. So that's something we've set out specifically around planning. On the rate system, our rate system is not fit for purpose. There's lots of business, of course, that will be frustrated by the next increase. I should note, though, over 50% of businesses in Scotland will actually pay no or less national insurance contribution, but particularly for the retail and hospitality sector that have a jobs rate above maybe 8 staff, closer to 14, 15 staff, they will see a negative from the NICs. But they aren't getting the reliefs that exist in the rate system in other parts of the country because it's not passed on here by the Scottish Government. We have got to reform our rate system to, in the short term, we're giving the 40% rates relief to the retail and hospitality sector, but in the longer term, reforming our rate system to break the imbalance where the online giants are paying a tiny, tiny proportion of their turnover in rates, whereas those high streets that the online giants are eating alive are paying an exponentially higher amount of their turnover in our rate system. So we've got to fundamentally reform our rate system. Our enterprise agencies and our public sector bodies, why do we need so many enterprise agencies? Why are they sucking up so much resource? We should be streamlining those agencies and those organisations with a set strategy centred. So we would have an economics director at the heart of the First Minister's office, and then look at regional economic development underneath that to strip away so much of the bureaucracy and actually put the resources where it needs.
You're writing a manifesto here.
I'm giving detail, Bernard, because I think it's important because you rightly made the criticism that people will say, okay, what are you planning on doing differently? I spent a lot of time thinking about what we're going to do differently, particularly on the economy, on the NHS, because they are two things that are close to my heart, two things that I think will be the key drivers of the election in 2026, and the two biggest things that will be the priority for the Scottish Labour government if we're successful. I could have went on for the other levers, but I can see Alex getting agitated.
We're pulling a lever that says shut up.
We do need to conclude the podcast this year.
Alex, at least you can say he's got lots of ideas rather than there's no idea.
Well, drowning in detail, perhaps. You talk about how, in your view, the tax burden is too high. All right. But it is not so very long. It's only a couple of years since you were proposing a 50% rate of tax on earnings over £100,000 a year, which actually functionally, once you take into account the withdrawal of the personal allowance and so on, is a functional rate of well over 60% above that. You presumably no longer favour that. So why did you think that then? What changed your mind and why were you wrong?
So I think three things. One is you had to look at the politics and the context at the time where there was a clear challenge around public finances and we had to get an injection into our public finances, and that was a lever that we
But this wouldn't have raised any money, would it?
No, exactly, and I'm just coming to that point. So one, you got to look at the situation. Secondly, you have to look at the evidence, and any politician that refuses to look at the evidence and can't admit that actually after the evidence their mind shifts or that they look at a different approach, is if you look at the tax decisions made in the last budget, it now looks like that the changes to the upper rate of tax actually will have less money coming in
the Scottish government's budget,
rather than more money coming in. And any government actually that is presented with evidence that shows that 90% of what they're predicted to raise won't come in because of behaviour change, but still chooses to do it because of the optics and the politics shows you that they're not a serious government. So that's the second part. And the third part is we've now decisively ended the year of austerity. There is now £5 billion of money available to the Scottish Government that wasn't available to it 4 months ago. What they choose to do with that money is now going to be crucial, because I think one of the frustrating things, and Bernard alluded to this earlier on, is all of this additional revenue is coming in, but people have to see the benefit of it. And if the SNP choose to carry on doing more of the same, filling their own financial mismanagement, carrying on with the same incompetence, not reforming our public services, then we will squander the game-changing opportunity of that £5 billion. And that's what I fear is going to happen. Is this no change of direction, keep doing what we're doing, keep plugging away, keep shoveling in the gaps and hope things work out. It's not worked for Scotland, and it's why we need a new direction.
Although quite rightly I'm not going to write a manifesto. What you would say there about tax is interesting in that I would take it as a clear signal it is not part of your plans to increase taxes for ordinary Scots should you become First Minister. Now, I do not believe that any political party will go into the 2026 election proposing tax increases. So in a sense, the much more difficult thing that you have, and you've explained very clearly in this podcast where a lot of your priorities are, fixing some of the problems of the National Health Service, absolutely key. Fixing the broken social care sector, absolutely key. Not only in terms of fixing this will you have to find more resources, but given that the experience of the past is that the policy of simply throwing more money into public services does not give you better outcomes, or it doesn't give you proportionate outcomes. I mean, look at the explosion in public expenditure after 97 under the Blair and Brown years. And yes, there were certainly improvements, but they probably weren't commensurate with the amount of money that was going in, which is why I suspect that people like Wes Streeting say it's about invest and reform. Now, what I hear a lot from you is about the need for investment. What I hear less about is reform. What has to change structurally? What are the structural impediments in different aspects of the Scottish state which are an active barrier to successful policy outcomes?
So I think reform is a huge part, actually, rather than purely investment. I actually think throwing more and more money at bad policy is the wrong approach, and is one of the reasons why there's a fundamental breakdown between the public and government, because public don't trust government to spend their pennies and their pounds. And that's one of the fundamental breakdowns in our politics. So there has to be fundamental reform. And let's take health and social care as an example. So we often talk about how we're going to put more investment and more resources into our National Health Service. But are we spending every penny and every pound that goes into our health service right now in an appropriate way? I don't think we are. We're a population of 5.5 million people. Why do we need 50 boards? Why do we need so much bureaucracy? Why do we need so much management? Why do we need so much middle management? And when you talk to clinicians on the front line, their frustration is always the same, which is we've got all these managers that are actually a barrier to us delivering quality healthcare rather than helping us deliver quality healthcare. So we've got to remove whole layers of bureaucracy and spend less money on chief executives and finance directors and spend more money on doctors, consultants and nurses. So that's one fundamental reform in terms of the organisation. Second also is the role of digital. Is what more are we doing to bring our health service into the 21st century, 21 years, 24 years too late. We bring it into the 21st century and make it ready for the 22nd century. Third is workforce planning. We've had no credible workforce plan in our health and social care system for well over a decade. How do we have a proper credible workforce plan that matches our skills system with our education system and also our migration system to make sure we're delivering the outcomes we need to be able to reform and renew our health service? And the fourth part is, of course, money, but we've got to spend that money well. Procurement being one part, a huge part actually of how you can spend our money better. But I think there's a more fundamental question around how the state operates now, government operates. I think if you look at the huge increase in the headcount and of government, and at the same time a huge reduction in productivity, I think there's a key gap there. And what I think fundamentally the key gap is not that the skill and the talent doesn't exist. I think the Auditor General's right. There's a lack of coherent strategy. There is a lack of leadership and perhaps the wrong people in the wrong roles. And that's why there has to be a fundamental shift in how government is organised and how government is operated. And I think that goes right across the board. We're now, I think it's over 120 public sector bodies in Scotland. At this rate, there's going to be more public sector bodies than MSPs in Scotland. It is completely bureaucracy heavy. And I think it's, again, a hallmark of this SNP government. Have lots of organisations, have lots of roundtables, have lots of working groups, have lots of strategy groups, have lots of engagement forums to buy people off or to mitigate them rather than actually trying to deliver positive, better outcomes, because it's a government that's been a campaign rather than being a government. I want to be a government. I don't want to be a campaign. I want to change Scotland, take us in a new direction, deliver positive outcomes, and make sure that this country is the best it can be and actually is a beacon of hope and opportunity for the rest of the UK and the rest of the world.
Okay, you say you want to be a government, not a campaign, but there is always a tension between these two things. Now, let me point you to one example from things you've said in the last couple of weeks. Scottish Scottish Labour, as best I understand it, now has a policy to reinstate the winter fuel allowance for all pensioners, but for it then to be tapered and steadily withdrawn from some pensioners at a future date. So the logic of this, by your own admission, is that you are going to restore a benefit and give it to people who, by your own logic, your own definition, don't need it.
So let me just break down the winter fuel payment in a bit more detail. First of
But
all,
that's correct, though, isn't it?
Let me explain the rationale behind the very good question you put to me, Alec. The rationale behind it is, I think the decision to cap it at the level of pension credit is not the right one, because there are lots of pensioners and lots of households who do require additional support, who perhaps might just miss out on pension credit because of how low that threshold is. So I've never been of the view that the pension credit threshold is the right one. Secondly, this is actually supposed to be a devolved benefit this year. Now, I accept the SNP government say that the quantum that they thought they had to spend was not the same because it's no longer a universal payment across the country. But they also ignored the fact that they had £41 million of household support fund money, that is money designed to go to low-income households to support them with their bills, that they never passed on to low-income households. And we suggested that we could take a different approach here in Scotland, which would broaden the criteria beyond pension credit. But instead they chose to give the power back to the Department for Work and Pensions. They actually give the power back to Westminster, an SNP government giving power back to Westminster because they don't have the gumption to take a different approach here. What I'm saying is we would take the power back from the DWP, we would reinstate the winter fuel payment, and we would work with relevant organisations and stakeholders to agree, if we think that this should be a taper benefit, what the correct taper would be. And I've always been of the view that using our tax system to taper it better is a better approach than taking the benefit away altogether. And the reason why, I'll give you one reason why and one perfect example of what I mean in practice. The reason why is, if you make it a benefit that purely people only get it if they apply for it, then the nature of those benefits is that many people who need the payment don't get it because they don't apply for it. And a good example of how this works in practice is take child benefit. When child benefit became a tapered benefit, so child benefit, everyone's entitled to receive child benefit. People have to opt out, so they universally receive child benefit, but the tax threshold, at what point it starts to get tapered away from higher income families, is the way it's done. So everyone who needs child benefit gets child benefit. I want to create a system where everyone who needs support gets it, and that's why we're saying we'd reinstate the winter fuel payment.
Okay, on another matter, if you look at universities in Scotland, they are under significant financial pressure, just as the university sector is across the whole of the United Kingdom. There are real long-term, obvious structural problems there with the long-term funding and financing of the university sector. For how long, and can current rates of state support for university in terms of the payment of tuition fees, how long can that last?
So I think there is an accepted view from devolution and across Scotland, the settled will, I would say, on certain issues that we are not going to relitigate. We support free tuition. We support having no prescription charges. These are things that we support and we're not going to reopen. But does the funding model for further and higher education have to change? Yes. And does our health and social care system have to be reformed? Yes. And I think there is a way to do it. And so when I'm speaking to university chancellors and university principals, what we're saying is, how do we collectively create a model that brings greater partnership between university, college and employers in order to get additional resource and capacity into our universities and our colleges? How do we change the mindset of how we think about education? I think right now we have a country where if you get a degree, you're viewed as taking the successful route and everything else is not seen as a success. That's not fair on the 50% of kids that don't go to university. How do we create a skill system that's for every kid, but also a skill system that recognises that you need lifelong learning? Our parents' generation only worked 2 or 3 jobs in their lives. the next generation's predicted to work 13, 14 jobs in their life. That emphasises, one, the risk for employers in terms of how much money and time they invest in an individual employee that then chooses to go somewhere else. But it also demonstrates why you can't have age barriers in terms of our apprenticeship system or our skill system. And that's the fundamental reform and rethink we're doing of our skill system, rather than opening up a false debate around whether we support free tuition or not. We do not support introducing tuition fees. We will not be introducing tuition fees, but we will fix our skill system. We support free prescriptions. We're not going to change what's happening with free prescriptions, but we're going to reform our health and social care system. That's the gains of devolution, but we need to have the next stage of devolution.
Our hour is almost up, and once again, thank you very much for your time. Perhaps one final question. If you are the largest party after the election in 2026, there was another poll out in recent days, which yet again are showing quite high levels of support for Reform UK, and in terms of the overall share of the votes for the respective parties, pointing to a really quite messy parliament after 2026. So if you are the leader of the largest party, if you can command a vote to be the next First Minister of Scotland, do you stand ready to work with anyone in the Parliament to deliver 65 MSPs behind a minority Labour government?
Well, the first thing I'd say is we want to try and win that election, and if we do win that election, we want to form a minority government. If you're asking me on an issue-by-issue basis whether we would seek to find consensus in our Parliament to get things done, of course we would. That's what the Parliament was designed to do. If you're asking a direct question about reform, I think we've got a fundamental lesson we have to learn, and I would say this particularly for those of us who are viewed as being the progressive left of centre part of politics, is what is driving people to go to parties like Reform, what is driving people to vote for what we would regard as being the most destructive, divisive option. What are the fundamental underlying characteristics? And I think the big frustration I've got with Labour politics, democratic politics in the US, and actually left of centre politics globally, is we keep confronting the symptoms, but we're not actually going after the cause. Why are people so disaffected? Why do they think politics doesn't work for them? Why do they think the economy doesn't work for them? Why do they think institutions don't work for them? What is it about rising levels of inequality and poverty that we have to confront? Why are young boys in particular feeling so distant from the political process and the political system? Why is it that there's this great divide now between young girls and young boys, young girls becoming more and more progressive, more liberal, young boys, particularly around some of the social media feeds, being pushed towards more divisive right-wing politics? I'm more interested in confronting those underlying causes and building a strong coalition of supporters.
More a question on numbers.
But fundamentally, the point I'm making with that, Bernard, is I think if we can get underneath the bonnet and confront the issues, I don't think we have to have that huge cohort of Reform MPs, MSPs that people are predicting coming out of the Parliament. I think we can build a different kind of coalition and a different kind of consensus of the people to deliver a Parliament that delivers for Scotland.
And Sarwar, thank you very much.
Just on that, Bernard, could you work with the SNP?
As I've said, on individual issues, I will not turn my back or close my eyes to any politician of any political party or any political party. I think we've got to be grown up about this.
But if the constitutional question was off the table for 5 years, you could do a deal with the SNP, couldn't you?
We would seek to form a minority government, but on individual issues, would we be willing to take ideas from other political parties, other politicians, and do what's in the best interest of Scotland? Absolutely. I want to be a First Minister for all of Scotland. I want to deliver an effective government here in Scotland, but that means winning an election first, and that's what I'm focusing on.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for your time over the course of the last hour. That's it from this edition of the podcast here from the award-winning Press Bar in Albion Street in Glasgow. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.